Hi, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Wherever you find us, whether it's a video or podcast on your favorite platform, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. You can also find us on major social media platforms. If you go to miamighostchronicles.com, you can find links to the videos or MP3 files, which you can download and enjoy without commercial interruptions. If you're into classic horror, ghost, and adventure stories, I narrate Nightshade Diary, and you can find links at nightshadediary.com. If scary stories are your bag, and listening to encounters with cryptids, ghosts, dogman, and other weird creatures sends a shiver up your spine, then go to supernaturalstorytime.com for links to our weekly podcasts. Noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird can be found at eerie.news or visit the Stranger Than Fiction Stories tab at miamighostchronicles.com. Please subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just go to mppellicer.com for a link. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Stories of the Supernatural, and this week we're going to travel back in time. It's 1894, and this is from the series Mysteries of Old Florida, Volume 5. So, we're going to a small settlement in central Florida called Lawtey, and it began to take shape in the mid-1800s with the arrival of the Florida Railroad in the 1850s. A railroad depot was established there, and the town began to develop as a center for trade and commerce. The city's name Lawtey is said to have been derived from a local landowner or a variation of a family name. In June 1894, Dr. Gustavus Drollshagen and his wife Hedwig, who lived about a mile east of Lawtey, Florida, were murdered in their sleep. Witnesses at the scene said that Dr. Drollshagen was lying on the right side of the bed, covered up with the bedclothes. The woman was lying by his side, but was not under the bedclothes, and her nightrobe was pulled up above her waist. The body showed she had struggled after being shot in the right eye, but she had been struck over the head with what was probably the butt of a pistol. Mule tracks were found at the gate, and the tracks matched the description of a small mule stolen from Mr. J. G. Alvarez's farm, about 6 miles west of Lawtey, that same night. A few days later, the couple were buried in the Lawtey cemetery. In the 1885 census, Drollshagen was listed as being 70 years old and his wife was 32 years old. The couple had no family in the area and lived by themselves. Drollshagen had moved to Lawtey from Norwalk, Ohio, 14 years before. There was a story told that he had once been a Catholic priest, and when he immigrated from Germany, he brought Louise Klossman, who was said to have been a nun. They lived together for 2 years, and then Hedwig, her sister, came from Germany to visit. Shortly thereafter, Hedwig and Drollshagen married. Louise, it was said, died shortly after the marriage. Whether this was true or not is unknown. There seemed to be several motives for their murder. The first being that while living in Lawtey, the Drollshagens ran a general merchandise business. They sold out the business on June 1st, only 3 weeks before they were killed, and it was believed they had a good deal of money from the transaction. Despite living in a sparsely populated area where the residents were familiar with each other and made note of strangers, over a month after the crime, there were no arrests, and the county commissioners offered a reward of $200. It wasn't until January 1896 that resolution seemed to be at hand. At the center of what appeared to be a murder conspiracy was George Mueller. He was arrested and taken to the prison at Stark. In the meantime, a young German named Max Bach was brought back from New York by Sheriff Johns and District Attorney Hartridge as the principal in the crime. When Mueller was arrested at his home in Tampa, they read the warrant to him, and Miller said, "Never mind, I know what you want, and I'll go along with you." He said to the officer that he associated in Jacksonville with Max Bach as a friend and that he only went with him to advise him and keep him from doing wrong, as he knew Max was a wild fellow. Bach was Drolshagen's nephew. Bach's version was different. He said that Mueller worked in a Jacksonville stable where he hired a horse and buggy and drove the hired murderers out to Lawtey after nightfall. His payout for the deed was supposed to be $300. Mueller laid his problems at the doorstep of a man named Henry Vesper. It seemed that Mueller had once worked for Henry Vesper, and Vesper proposed to Mueller to kill Drolshagen and take his money. Mueller refused. Mrs. Mueller said that Vesper dragged her husband into the conspiracy because he still owed him money from unpaid wages. Mrs. Miller said that while living in Jacksonville, they worked in a restaurant on Bay and Hogan Streets, and that Max Bach stayed with them. She did confirm to police that Bach, who had stopped paying them for boarding, had come into money after the murder, but never settled with them for the time he lived there for free. Henry Vesper was arrested in 1895 on a charge of burglary. However, he was cleared of the charge. He, like George Mueller, moved to Tampa. It was said that Max Bach proved he was the murdered man's nephew and only heir. After filing a claim on his uncle's property, which was valued at $25,000, he left to Brooklyn where he married Maria La Fianza, a young widow who he had met in Jacksonville. They moved to 105 Hamburg Avenue, Brooklyn, and he worked as a druggist. He was arrested on January 1st, based on a warrant sworn out by the administrator of Drolshagen's estate, Mr. Edward Todd. The allegations were that Maximilian Bach hired George Miller to kill his uncle and his wife after he found out his uncle had disinherited him. Beside the murder, they were there to find and destroy the latest will. $900 in cash were also missing from the couple's home. Mueller, who was arrested on January 3rd, was released on the 21st after being charged with complicity in the Drolshagen murder. He returned to Tampa, where he was running a tent restaurant on the old Opera House site on Franklin Street. Max Bach was also released. While living in Jacksonville, Mueller worked on the night shift at Otis's, a well-known lunchroom, and supposedly this was how he established his alibi, since Mr. Otis verified he was working at the restaurant the night of the crime. A queer coincidence in connection to the timing on Bach's arrest was the signing of a decree in a civil suit conveying the property left by the murdered man. The decree involved the case of Sophia Glossman versus Max Bach and Nicholas Bach, in which Glossman, a sister of the murdered woman, was entitled to a half interest in coparcenary with the defendant to the property found in Bradford, Clay, and Alachua counties. Then, in an unexpected turn, on February 5, 1896, 3 weeks after Mueller was released, Frank E. Hughes, a well-known Gainesville lawyer who defended him, committed suicide. His friends were astonished, and everyone remembered his recent involvement in defending George Mueller. It was said that soon after his return to Gainesville, he received a telegram with the news of the death of his brother in a Brooklyn hospital. Hughes left to Boston with his sister. It was said he was drinking heavily and after a few days departed on the steamer Tallahassee for Savannah. Early one morning, a waiter saw him near the rail on the starboard side of the bow. He had thrown his muffler on the deck and was trying to take off his overcoat. The waiter caught him by the coat collar, and a deckhand came to help, describing that Hughes raged like a madman. Then Hughes slipped out of his overcoat and dropped into the river. There was no doubt it was an act of suicide. There were letters among his things that mentioned financial troubles. When the dust had settled, no one was ultimately charged and convicted of a cold-blooded murder. It's unknown if the prosecution didn't move forward because they only had circumstantial evidence and George Mueller provided an alibi through his boss. What is known is that after the Drolshagens were killed, George Mueller, Henry Vesper, and Max Bach left Jacksonville. which was only 32 miles away from Lawtey, each to run their own businesses. All of those involved were born in Germany, and even though Bach was the murdered man's nephew, it's unknown if Drollshagen knew the other two. So here we have what seems like a conspiracy for murder. They were all Germans, and it seemed that for some reason, if it was true, Drollshagen had disinherited his nephew, and maybe this is why he decided not to wait for his uncle to die. He needed to get a hold of that new will disinheriting him. And what's strange of it all is that they all lived in Jacksonville, and after the death of the Drollshagens, everyone left. Mueller and Vesper went to Tampa, and Max Bach left to Brooklyn. Now let's go on to our second story. Our second story takes place in a little town in Florida called Lutz. And the first settlement in the area, which is known as Lutz, originally was a Catholic mission started in the late 1880s by Luxembourg Catholic priest Francis Xavier Stemper. Those who settled in the Stemper colony were not Germans, but people from the small country of Luxembourg. The Stemper post office was established on November 17, 1893, with Stemper as the postmaster. The old Stemper colony dwindled away in the early 1900s, but thrived again a few years later as people moved there to work in the turpentine industry. Artifacts from the old Stemper colony can still be found even under the front yards of some of the local residents, namely the old cemetery. None of the buildings remain today, but some of the lumber from the old church was used to build the garage of a local resident. Stemper School was in operation for several years. German immigrant children sat side by side with local Florida crackers. Classes were separated by gender. The boys were taught by Father Stemper himself, and the girls were taught by a Miss Nelson, who would ride her white horse to school every day from Lake Magdalene. Now let's fast forward to May of 1921. A lazy circle of buzzards over a remote cow pasture alerted the attraction of berry pickers. Floating in the middle of a pond was the object of their attention. It was the badly decomposed body of a woman floating face up that was later identified as Aurora Hernandez, who lived at 915 7th Avenue, Lutz, Florida. She had been missing for 10 days. The pond where Aurora Hernandez was found was about 2 miles away from a roadway or a house. She wore a nightgown-type dress, and she had a large hole over the right breast, which showed 2 ribs had been broken, which could only have been caused by the force of a hard blow. She was seen leaving her home on Friday, May 13th, while her grandson was at work. She was said to have sought information as how to get back to Ybor City, and then was later seen at Sulphur Springs, where she asked for similar directions. She was 78 years old and spoke no English. Her grandson, Domingo Penalved, identified her by the ring she was wearing. He met with Constable Johnson at the small house in the Martí burial grounds at West Tampa. She was buried right after due to the advanced decomposition of the body. Dr. H. O. Snow, the county physician, performed an autopsy, but due to the deteriorated state of the body, he could not verify the cause of death. Little flesh was left upon the skull, and the physician confirmed the blow that broke her ribs practically caved in the entire side of the breast. The lower jaw was missing, and there were several other holes in the body at various places, but he could not determine if they were made by buzzards or were actual injuries. The afternoon of the day she was buried, Constable Johnson was brought word that several people living in the area saw a woman answering Aurora's description walking along a roadway in the neighborhood of where she was found. They saw 2 men following her. Constable Johnson then received a report she had been killed by an automobile and that her body was carried to the lake and left there by the driver to cover up the crime. A jury found she came to her death by causes unknown. Her grandchildren, Domingo and Georgina Penalved, told the jury that for some time her mind had been affected and that she had previously left her home and wandered about. That she was murdered was evident, but was it for robbery or was she struck by a vehicle? She still wore 3 gold rings, so robbery, though possible, seems doubtful. However, the severity of her injuries are more plausible as being caused by a vehicle. But instead of taking her for medical attention, or at the very least calling the police, the driver took her over 2 miles away and dumped her in a lake. If not for the buzzards and the berry pickers, who the family would have always wondered what happened to their loved ones. So you could say this was not an intentional murder. Maybe by mistake. Who knows? But I guess the best option for whoever that driver was to throw the old lady in the lake. Next story. We're going now to Jacksonville. And it's the last 2 days of 1920. December 29th. And a couple are found slain in a Jacksonville hotel located at 915 West Bay Street. The man was shot twice through the chest, and the woman was shot once through the forehead. She was still alive but unconscious when the police entered through a window since the door was locked. They had registered as Mr. and Mrs. W.F. Meadows. A keyring plate in the dead man's possession bore the engraving J.A. Sandifer and an Oklahoma City address. Letters in the room were addressed to Mr. and Mrs. W.F. Meadows. Then police received a telegram from E.D. Carter of Elliston, Virginia, asking for a description of the couple, which eventually proved to be moot since the identity of the couple was soon established. In the absence of identifying the woman, Mr. W.F. Walker was traveling from Memphis to Jacksonville in search of his daughter, who he said married W.F. Meadows, whose name was used to register at the hotel. Mr. Meadows of Moultrie, Georgia, also traveled to Jacksonville, but after viewing the man's body, said it was not his son, William Meadow. He said he did have an older married son who lived in Oklahoma. Mr. Meadows said he knew nothing of Willie's marriage to anyone. The body of the man was ordered to be shipped to Owensboro, Kentucky for burial by order of one of his brothers, who verified the identity of the dead man. By January 2nd, 1921, it was noted in the newspapers that Jake Sandifer was the son of Burgess Alexander Sandifer, an Oklahoma City merchant who ran a feed store. Originally, the family was from Kentucky, and father and son had run the business in Oklahoma. The whereabouts of Willie Meadows had not been ascertained at the time of the crimes, and the police were unable to locate him in Oklahoma or elsewhere. Meadows Sr. stated he had no communication from his son lately. A day later, the woman died, and she was identified as Mrs. W.F. Meadows, age 17, of Memphis, Tennessee, by her father, W.F. Walker, who had traveled from Memphis. He claimed his daughter had married W.F. Flowers. In the daily newspaper, her full name was never published, as well as the name of the hotel where the incident occurred. However, her true identity was Effie Lee Meadows Nee Walker, born October 29, 1902. She married Willie Felton Meadows, age 19, on October 18, 1920, in Memphis, Tennessee. She lied saying she was 19 years old, since she was technically 17 years old on the date of her marriage and would have needed parental consent to marry. Mr. Walker stated that he was confident that a third party was responsible for the death of the man whom he said he did not know and of his daughter. He stated he received a letter from his daughter, written the day before she was discovered in a dying condition, in which she was optimistic enough about life and perfectly normal in all of her statements. No doubt, due to the shameful circumstances of her demise, she was buried in Evergreen Cemetery in Jacksonville, and not in Memphis, where the family lived. Her parents were doomed to outlive their children. The other daughter, Frances, died in 1934, age 20, in childbirth, along with her son Walter. The authorities believe the woman shot Sandifer as he lay sleeping in bed and then turned the weapon upon herself, which if true would have been proven to be a difficult shot, since it was described her wound was on her forehead. However, this is not what the police originally believed. When they arrived, the room was locked, but they suspected a third party shot the couple and escaped before guests were aroused, and police tested the theory since they were able to enter through a window. Also, neither of them had powder burns on their skin from a shot taken at close range. So how did Effie Meadows end up dead in a Jacksonville hotel room with a man who was really named Jack Sandifer but assumed the identity of her husband? And to add to the mystery, where was the real Willie Meadows, who had not only responded to his father's telegrams, or so his father claimed, and who it appeared had married behind his back only 2 months before? Had his bride run away with another man? Why would Effie Meadows kill the man she had just run away with and then herself? Or could it be possible that Jack Sandifer used Meadows' name on the marriage certificate? And if so, why would he do this? After the initial story appeared in the newspapers, it dropped completely from view. Willie Flowers remarried in 1930, had children, and died in 1960 at the age of 59. The incident no doubt was closed out as a lurid murder-suicide. But what if it was murder after all? Then, who was it who pulled the trigger? Indeed. Our next story is in that same time period, 1921, but now it's Miami, and this is a true murder mystery. A body is discovered on a lonely road 10 miles west of Miami, and it would be identified by Fred Pine, who was the Dade County solicitor. The dead man was his brother, and the Tamiami Trail, which stretched westward into the Everglades, would be known as a place where bodies would be left since it was a desolate place. The victim's name was Captain James A. Pine, and his murder mystified the city. He was a well-known and well-liked man in Miami, and his family had lived there for many years. His father, James Pine Sr., was considered a settler in Coconut Grove and had served in the Union Army during the Civil War, attaining the rank of captain. He also served as Miami's postmaster and passed away in 1905. Prior to his arrival in Miami, James Pine Jr. served as the assistant keeper at the Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse from 1893 to 1896. From there, he moved to Miami, where he captained several charter yachts, including the Orion, the Araconda, and the Cynthiana, which he owned. At one point, Captain Pine lived with his wife and 4 children on the Four Pines, a houseboat moored at the mouth of the Miami River. Captain Pine did not lead a dull life, even though few ever believed he would find his end at the hands of a murderer. In December 1904, he was rescued by lifeguards at Jupiter when he almost drowned. Then in 1912, he suffered a head injury when a roller slipped from under one end of a timber when he was working under a scow. He was bleeding from his mouth, ears, and nose due to a fractured skull. Luckily, H.J. Park, a New York millionaire, paid for his care in Johns Hopkins Hospital. He described Captain Pine as his trusted hunting and fishing companion when he would come to vacation in Florida. However, despite his reputation for being well-liked, not all felt that way about him. In October 1915, he was arrested based on a complaint of Mrs. W. E. Shackelford. He was charged with assault and battery. It was claimed that he choked Mrs. Shackelford and threatened to kill her. Captain Mallow from the yacht Stranger interfered since he believed the woman was about to be severely beaten. Pine was eventually charged only with disorderly conduct. Captain Pine countered the woman's allegations, saying he merely prevented her from hurling abusive language at him. Her husband also figured in the case since she was divorcing him. Overall, it was described as a neighborhood quarrel. Pine continued in his work, taking wealthy New Yorkers on fishing trips along the Florida coast and into the Keys. He also visited Nassau. In December 1920, Captain Pine was arrested and his boat, the Cynthiana, with A cargo of whiskey valued at $40,000 was seized near Savannah. He was released on bond and returned to Miami, and the liquor was supposedly owned by a Savannah saloon keeper named Cottingham. None expected the 47-year-old man would be found dead on February 22nd, 1921. This was only 2 months after his arrest in Savannah. His body that was found on a lonely road near the glass sawmill was at a well-known place called the Montgomery Corner. He had suffered extensive injuries to his head. He was so bloody and disfigured that even men who knew him did not recognize the body until it was taken to the undertaker and the blood was removed from his face. The undertaker found 6 or 7 deep gashes in the back of the head, apparently made by a hatchet. A number of the cuts penetrated to the brain. It appeared to have been attacked from behind. Eddie Pine, a fireman at the Central Fire Station in Miami, identified his father once the body was brought to King Undertaking Company. Later, Ada Pine, his wife, who described that her husband had left the house the night before with a strange man who called to see him. A neighbor later told police about a stranger who had asked directions to the captain's house from her. She described him as middle-aged with a long, drooping mustache, shabbily dressed with an accent. This fit the description of a man who registered at the Biscayne Hotel the previous Saturday and asked the clerk to call Captain Pine over the telephone, but he was unable to do so. Captain Pine did eventually come to the hotel, and the clerk saw them talking on the upper porch of the hotel for some time. Eventually, the stranger did show up at the Pine house around 8:30 p.m. They talked for 15 minutes on the porch, and then they left together toward the Curtis Bright Ranch to see the man's partner on a business matter. Pine told his wife not to wait up for him. The police were tipped off about a stranger, about 50 years of age, who was last seen with Captain Pine, and that a green automobile shot at Officer Frank Croft, who was on a motorcycle the morning of the murder. They crowded him off the road, and he was unable to pursue them. He would go on to find James Pine's body still warm on the side of the road in a ditch. Many saw Pine's murder as substantiation of rumors of a war among the bootleggers of South Florida. The war stemmed from organized booze runners trying to stop outlaw bootleggers. Pine's friends argued the most plausible theory was that someone was afraid that since his arrest in Savannah, he might give information and start a sweeping investigation into the Miami Bimini liquor traffic. There was no denying that he knew all the boat owners up and down the coast. Leads dried up after several initial arrests. However, police claim that circumstantial evidence pointed to Ludwig Kohlweiss, an Austrian who farmed near the Curtis Bright Ranch. A reward for $3,000 was offered for the arrest of the murderer, and a price was placed on Kohlweiss's head when he fled the country. It wasn't certain if he fled to his native country or elsewhere. His wife Emma and brother Mike Kohlweiss of Moorhaven were under arrest for some time as possible accessories, but were subsequently released. A large quantity of dried blood was found underneath the Ford truck body in their possession, and it was believed to have been the murder car. There was also blood-stained clothes belonging to Kohlweiss found in a corner of the room, hidden under a pile of other clothing. It was also determined that Kohlweiss had financial problems, which might have spurred his decision to kill Pine, either to rob him or to receive some type of payoff from someone who wanted the boat captain killed. In October 1922, it was found that Ludwig Kohlweiss was held in a Mexican jail under the assumed name of Pedro Pablo Fischer. He had tried to hold up a local bank. Due to the strained relations between the United States and Mexico, they would not extradite him. However, they did say that he was to be expelled from Mexico, and officials from Dade County were hoping to take charge of him at the border. Sheriff Lewis A. Allen was ready to leave Florida and travel to the Mexican border at Laredo, Texas, once the Mexican consul advised him that Kohlweiss was to be deported. While the investigation into Captain Pine's murder played out, his widow lived her own turbulent life. Within 8 months of her husband's death in October 1921, Ada Pine married J. Hart, better known as Red Hart. However, it seemed that Ada was not meant to find happiness so soon. In February 1922, only 4 months after they were married, J. Hart disappeared with Linton Stranger, captain of the yacht Rochester, and Leon Walker, a fisherman who worked around Alcer Pier. The three men had gone off to Bimini, and it was feared they had been drowned during a squall that caught them in open waters. Eddie Pine flew to Bimini and verified the boat never arrived there, and that nothing had been seen or heard of the missing men. Then, on February 11, 1922, the search for the missing men took a strange turn. A Japanese man was taken into custody when blood was found on his shirt. He was a hanger-on at a resort on Northwest 4th Street near the north side of the Miami River, opposite where the dismembered body of a man was found floating on the river. An examination of the shirt found the blood was probably human, but old. Ada Hart, along with James Rhodes, a son-in-law, went to the morgue to view what was left of the body. By then, her husband had been missing about 3 weeks. Mrs. Hart was positive the remains did not belong to her husband. Rhodes said that Hart had carried with him about $850 when he was last seen alive by his relatives, and there was suspicion he had been murdered for the money. 2 other portions of the body were found the following day in the river. One was the other half of the torso, and the other was part of the intestines that were found floating in the Siebold Canal. The second half of the torso contained the vertebrae and fitted the quarter piece of the body found initially. There were marks of a knife on the side, but it wasn't known if this was how the victim was killed or the wounds were made during dismemberment. It was believed the body was caught up in a bathtub and the pieces were disposed of by throwing them into the river. The only mark of possible identification on the body was a mole about the size of a quarter just below the left shoulder blade. The Japanese man was eventually released. Then the mystery of the men's disappearance was solved when a cablegram was received, describing where all 3 men were picked up by a schooner which had left Puerto Rico bound for New York. The men had spent 4 days tossed about on the ocean and were picked up about 25 miles off the coast of Cuba. They eventually traveled back to Miami once the ship had docked in New York. J. Hart was arrested only a few months later on January 1923, charged with illegal possession of liquor. Hart lived on the houseboat the Chippewa, where deputies found 5 quarts of House of Lords whiskey and 3 pints of Irish. He, along with another man, were released on bonds of $500 each. It seemed that Mrs. Hart was also implicated, and in March her husband paid a fine of $50 and her case was dismissed. J, aka Red Hart, appeared not to be able to stay out of trouble. Ada Hart not only had to worry about her husband, but her son as well. In August 1923, Edward Pine and J.W. Williams were fined $1,000 and sentenced to 1 year each at Waycross, Georgia, when they were found illegally transporting 10 cases of liquor in an automobile. In July 1924, J. Hart was arrested for gambling and possessing gambling devices. 6 months later, in January of 1925, he was arrested for illegal possession of 5 quarts of liquor he carried in his automobile. Somewhere during those years, it seemed Ada secured a divorce from J. Hart, but it's never specified what ended the union. Perhaps she just got tired of his shenanigans. What became of J. Red Hart, who had served in the military during World War I and also as a fireman in Miami in his early years, also remains a mystery. Ada Pine married Raymond de Medicis in 1930, only to die in November of that year after she took a fall from her front porch and fractured her skull. She was 54 years old. Even though Captain Pine's murderer was identified, there is no further mention if he was finally apprehended at the border by U.S. officers. Due to lack of information, charges are that Cole Weiss was not arrested. Otherwise, a story would have been published that he was being returned to Miami to stand trial for the murder. And as to the identity of the man who was dismembered and tossed into the Miami River, he too remained unnamed and unavenged.